He never lied, he never killed, he never failed to show up. And that is exactly the problem. The moment you place a being of near infinite power inside a moral framework with zero margin for error, you haven't created a protector, you've created a ceiling, a hard limit on what humanity is allowed to become on its own terms. Superman doesn't threaten human autonomy by turning evil, he threatens it by staying good. That's the question this video is actually asking, not whether Clark Kent will eventually break, but whether a world that depends on him not breaking was ever structurally sound to begin with.
The mythology of Superman is built on a single load-bearing premise, that absolute power can be permanently anchored to absolute restraint. Every institution that grew up around him, every government that tolerated his presence, every ally that trusted his judgment, every civilian who stopped preparing for catastrophe made a quiet, collective decision. They decided that Kal-El's morality was stable enough to replace their own infrastructure of deterrence. Think about what that actually means. Human civilization developed accountability systems over centuries, separation of powers, international law, military oversight, mutual deterrence. These weren't built because humans are inherently good. They were built because humans are unpredictable, and unchecked power, even well-intentioned power, historically accelerates towards consolidation. Superman's presence didn't strengthen those systems. It gave the world permission to trust something outside them. The belief that sustained this arrangement was simple. He's better than us. Not just physically, morally. Kryptonian biology filtered through Kansas ethics produced something the human political system never could, a power source with no personal agenda. And the world exhaled, leaned back, let the cape do the heavy lifting. That's not security. That's structural dependency dressed as hope.
Here's what that dependency actually produces over time. When a population knows a near omnipotent moral agent will intervene, it begins, slowly, systemically, to outsource judgment. Not because people are lazy, because rational actors respond to incentives. If Superman stops the missile, why fund the negotiation? If he rebuilds the flooded city, why redesign the infrastructure? If he's always the final answer, what's the point of developing a second answer? This is the erosion that doesn't look like erosion. It looks like relief. And there's a counter-argument worth engaging here. Some analysts, both in-universe and in critical discourse, argue that Superman's presence actually elevates human ambition, that the existence of a moral ideal inspires humans to reach higher, to codify better ethics, to build institutions that reflect the standard he sets. That argument fails for one structural reason. Inspiration and dependency are not the same load. Inspiration asks you to climb. Dependency gives you a ride and calls it the same destination. The humans who built the Geneva Conventions did so because there was no Superman. The humans who designed nuclear deterrence did so because no moral constant existed to make it unnecessary. Remove the threat, remove the urgency, remove the capability. Now add Superman, not as a threat, as a guarantee. Every villain who ever argued for human self-determination, Luthor consistently, was technically making a structurally coherent point. Not a good person making it, but a coherent point. The argument that humanity cannot evolve under permanent paternalistic surveillance is not fascism. It's developmental psychology applied to civilization. The fracture isn't Superman failing. The fracture is the world discovering it built itself around him without realizing it.
Now consider what this arrangement does to Clark Kent. The public myth requires him to be stable, not mostly stable, perfectly, consistently, unquestionably stable, because the entire security architecture of the Western world, and increasingly the global order, is calibrated to his good intentions. That's not a burden, that's a trap. Clark was raised to internalize restraint as identity. Jonathan Kent's guidance was never use your power wisely. It was closer to don't let them see it. The foundation of Superman's morality isn't confidence, it's suppression. Carefully managed, relentlessly maintained suppression of a capacity that could level continents. Moral absolutism at that scale doesn't produce clarity. It produces a man who cannot afford to have a bad day. The psychological literature on sustained moral performance is unambiguous. Individuals who define their identity through perfect ethical conduct under pressure don't stay stable. They develop rigidity. They conflate their self-worth with their restraint record. And when the suppression finally costs them something real, a person they couldn't save, a line they had to cross, a moment where the math of justice didn't work out clean, the internal architecture strains in ways the exterior never shows. Superman's smile is not calm, it's load-bearing. And a world whose security depends on that smile staying fixed is not a safe world. It's a world one psychological threshold away from a completely different conversation.
The DC universe has, in various timelines, asked what happens when that threshold is crossed. Injustice, the Elseworlds continuities, Kingdom Come, each of them arrives at the same structural conclusion through different emotional roads. When Superman's moral framework fractures, regardless of cause, the world doesn't fill the vacuum with its own rebuilt infrastructure. It fractures along him. Those who believe he was right, those who believe he was compromised, those who always knew this was coming and were never allowed to say so in polite company. What shifts permanently in each of these scenarios isn't just Superman's reputation, it's the legitimacy of the entire model. The institutions that leaned on him lose credibility because they were never truly independent. The heroes who deferred to him lose identity because their judgment had been, in practice, optional. The public, which had traded self-determination for security, discovers that the trade had no return policy. Luthor gains not because he was right in character, but because he was right in structure. He called the dependency. He named the fragility. He was wrong about almost everything except the core premise. That's the uncomfortable part of the reorganization. The villain's diagnosis was accurate, only the cure was poison.
So let's sit with the actual question. Is Superman dangerous because he might eventually break, or is he dangerous precisely because he probably won't? A hero who stays perfect indefinitely doesn't give the world room to grow past needing him. Every generation that lives under his protection is a generation that didn't have to develop the muscle. Every crisis he resolves is a crisis humanity didn't have to survive on its own terms. There's a version of this argument that sounds like it's asking Superman to fail on purpose, to step back and let people suffer so they can build character. That reading is deliberately uncharitable. The actual argument is architectural. It's not about what Superman chooses to do in any given moment. It's about what the world becomes when it stops treating its own survival as its own responsibility. Superman's morality isn't the threat because it's false. It's the threat because it's real. And because real moral constants, when placed at the center of social infrastructure, prevent the system from developing its own immune response. The immune response is the point. Without it, the organism doesn't fail slowly. It fails catastrophically the first time the constant is unavailable. One man, one moral framework, one threshold. That's not a safety net. That's a single point of failure with a cape.
The world didn't build Superman. It built a story about what it needed to believe was watching it. And stories are not structural. They're not load-bearing. They're explanations we give to fragility, so it feels like design. Superman is good. That has never been the issue. The issue is what good becomes when it removes the consequence of not being good enough on your own. He didn't take humanity's power. He made it comfortable to forget they had it. That comfort has a cost, and most people will never notice it until he isn't there.